U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping held their first face-to-face meeting in a year yesterday.
So we're back to direct, open, clear, direct communications on a direct basis.
Exchanging handshakes and smiles, both sides signaled a desire for stabilizing U.S. China relations. Biden's opening remarks warned the two nations should not veer into conflict, with the Chinese president echoing that planet Earth is big enough for two. So, is this a reset of China-U.S. relations? Vina Nadjibulla is the Vice President, Research and Strategy with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. We reach her at the APEC Summit. Vina, it's good to talk to you again.
It's good to speak with you as well, David.
We haven't seen things this kind of friendly between the United States and China in a while. I wonder, what was your impression of the meeting between President Xi and President Biden yesterday?
Absolutely. Well, the expectations for the meeting were very low, and I think both sides met those expectations. And you're absolutely right. Tensions have been reduced. There's a little bit better tone coming out of China, and certainly President Xi Jinping is trying to charm the business community that's gathered here and also the leaders from the 21 economies here at APEC. But my sense is that while it's good news that we have de-escalation in relations, it is unlikely to last given everything that's ahead for us in 2024.
Okay, I want to touch on that pessimistic note in just a second. But first,
not too pessimistic, just a cautious note.
I gotcha. But we do have this readout from China's foreign ministry saying the U.S. China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. A stable and growing China is good for the United States and the whole world. That does seem like warming rhetoric, right? So how should we read that?
Absolutely. We should see this as President Xi Jinping and CCP in China wanting to de-escalate tensions. The economy for China is not doing well right now, and they're really trying to make sure that people see that China is open for business and that there's still a lot of opportunity, that it's still the largest market. So you're absolutely right. This is a much more toned down version of rhetoric. This is not wolf warrior diplomacy by any stretch of imagination, right? So the rhetoric is certainly moving in the right direction. But I think, as President Biden said, you can trust, but you should verify. And a lot of what will happen next will depend on actions on the ground in China.
Right. So let's get back to what I called the pessimistic note, but what you call realistic. What do you think can potentially undo or chill some of this warming over the next year or so?
Yes. Well, and again, it's de-escalation, it's stabilization, right? I think the right language would be that we're stabilizing the relationship because both U.S. and China want that. On the other hand, I mean, we still have a lot of hot spots, right? The elections in Taiwan are going to be closely watched. It's good news, I guess, for President Xi Jinping that the two major opposition parties in Taiwan have now united, and they will try to present a much more a serious challenge to the ruling DPP party and the candidate, the vice president. But nonetheless, we will be watching closely what happens there, right? That election is really consequential. We're also seeing a lot of tension in the South China and East China Sea, right? Like what's happening off the shores of Philippines. Very much critical, and there's quite a bit of pressure. So it's good news that both President Biden and President Xi Jinping decided to resume the military-to-military dialogue because it's really about establishing guardrails and making sure that both sides know each other's red lines. So, but those tensions haven't gone away. Again, dialogue is good, de-escalation is good. There have been some positive outcomes from this meeting, but a lot will depend on what happens in the next few months, and the tensions are still going to be there.
You talk about Taiwan as a potential flashpoint, the sort of the military muscle flexing that's been happening in the South China Sea.
And Philippines.
Yes, exactly. So this is obviously the big concern, is that this could turn into another conflict in another theater. I wonder, from the China and U.S. perspective, what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, what's happening with Israel and Hamas, how much does that push them towards de-escalation and normalization to avoid a third major conflict breaking out?
Absolutely. There's definitely a desire to avoid a third theater, as you said, in the Indo-Pacific, primarily in the South China Sea. But there's also a recognition that the relationship between the U.S. and China have consequences for the Middle East, have consequences for what's happening in Ukraine. I think the situation in the Middle East certainly was dominating the conversations. It's dominating a lot of the discussions here in APEC as well, in terms of both the protests and the media attention. And there, while both US and China don't want to escalate the situation for their own reasons, I think it does serve China to some extent to have US distracted in the Middle East and in Europe, right? So whereas US would like to immediately resolve the issues, for the perspective of China, as long as the US has its hands full in the Middle East and in Ukraine, there's less bandwidth to deal with the Indo-Pacific.
The U.S. is also going to have its hands full with an election next year. I mean, you talked about
Absolutely.
the Taiwan election being consequential. I think the U.S. election might be the most consequential election in the world next year. I mean, how do you think that plays into this whole relationship?
Well, this was the last really opportunity for President Biden to have another meeting face to face with President Xi, right? And to put a floor underneath this relationship, in part because he doesn't want to have to deal with any major escalation of tension going into the election year here in the US, which is going to be really, really difficult to manage. We're already seeing a signature initiative that President Biden wanted to launch here at the APEC was around the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right? To show to China that U.S. is going to be a serious player in the economic realm in the Indo-Pacific. But that unfortunately didn't happen because of opposition in Congress, right? From Democrats, not even Republicans. So domestic politics in the U.S. is going to make it more challenging for the U.S. to be a reliable and a steady partner in the Indo-Pacific.
So Vina, just as a final point to bring in the Canadian angle here,
Yeah.
Canada's relationship with China, not great. Canada's relationship with India, not great, as all part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Where does Canada fit into this de-escalation between the U.S. and China and the APEC summit more broadly?
Absolutely. Well, at this point, Canada is the only G7 country that doesn't have high-level dialogue with China, right? We're still frozen out. We saw Australia re-engage after their difficult relationship with China was sort of going on for almost 5 years as well. So for us, given our relationship with China and our relationship with India, a lot of attention is currently on ASEAN, which is also why we're seeing the bilateral meetings that Prime Minister Trudeau's having here within Indonesia, with Thailand, and others as well. And of course, all the trade missions that are going to go to ASEAN in the beginning of 2024. So I think, and there's also conversations with Australia, which I hope will be largely around how do we manage our relations with China, and hopefully some lessons that Canada can learn from how Australia has stabilized its relations with China while also being a really close ally of the U.S. and taking part in AUKUS and the Quad and all of the other mechanisms that are now being put in place in the Indo-Pacific to deal with China.
Vina Nadjibulla, Vice President, Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.